Hey, thank you. So, welcome to this digital event. It's the March issue of our series this year, and this is a Pick-a-Periodical digital event. I'm Alison Chapman. I'm a professor of English at the University of Victoria in BC, in Canada. And I'm also vice president of RSVP. Part of my duties, my pleasures, is to organise a Digi event series this year. And I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Bethan Stevens, who is going to be talking to us about a periodical she's currently working on that I know very little about, so I'm eager to hear more. Bethan is reader in English and art writing at the University of Sussex. She works on word image culture in the long 19th century, creative criticism, and also print history. Her current book in progress is entitled Uncaring, which explores the history of care work through Victorian novels, print history, and also life writing. And as many of you know, Bethan's recent monograph, The Wood Engraver's Self-Portrait, is a study of the Dalziel Brothers. I am pronouncing it DL because of my Scottish history, but I'll stand corrected by Bethan because I was just shocked to find out that's not how the Dalziel Brothers called themselves. They anglicised their name, but I find it very difficult to say anything but DL, so I will stick with that and let Bethan correct me shortly. So the title of Bethan's talk is The Pictorial World in 1883, from Illustrated Magazine to Exhibition Space. And as a reminder, Bethan's going to speak for like around 20 minutes, and then there'll be plentiful time for questions and comments. If you want to ask a question, please put your hand up once Bethan's finished speaking. And you can also add comments and questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those as well. All right, so over to you, Bethan.
Thank you so much, Alison, for that lovely introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me too. I really love the pick a periodical prompt. I'm just going to try and share my slides. Hang on. Um, can everyone see? Oh, yeah, great. Okay. Um, and can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Fantastic. Okay, so I've chosen to talk about the Pictorial World, which was launched in 1874. And it was pitched as an ambitious, cheap, illustrated weekly newspaper that sought to compete with the graphic and the illustrated London News. The size of the paper changed over time, but in the 1870s, it was 43 centimetres high, 3 or 4 centimetres taller than its rivals, and special issues could be twice that. The paper was noted for its large pull-out prints and posters, often colour printed on one side of the page and featuring the best and latest printmaking techniques. In this short talk, I'm going to give a kind of whirlwind history of the magazine as a whole, including its management, its approach to visual art, and its approach to readers. I will then mostly focus on the volume for 1882 to 1883, when the magazine was at its most ambitious and its most extravagant, thinking through how it was marketed as a kind of exhibited spectacle. I'll briefly sketch a case study of the issue for June the 2nd, 1883, with coverage of the coronation in Moscow of Tsar Alexander III and the first instalment of George Sims' landmark investigation of London, How the Poor Live. The Pictorial World would really benefit from more attention. It's not an easy periodical to research because it hasn't been digitized. I put a link to this resource from a data set we produced at the British Museum from the Dalziel archive, and most of the online photographs I found of the magazine are derived from this data set. But it really does offer a partial picture because that archive only preserves the illustrations and only those produced or brokered by the wood engraving firm Dalziel Brothers. And there were lots of other engravers and lithographers involved. I have examined runs of the magazine in the British Library and the National Art Library, but many of the copies are incomplete. I've put images on these slides of some of the extremely helpful research, which you'll be familiar with, that illuminate work that's been done by contributors to the Pictorial World, such as illustrator Hal Ludlow, journalist Randolph Caldecott and George R. Sims, and many others. But the paper has never, to my knowledge, become a focus of research in its own right. I've included on the slide my book on the Dalziel Brothers, which has brief discussion of the paper, but there wasn't space to say very much about it there. So I've been continuing to research the periodical, and I'm really excited to have the chance to talk about it today. So in 1874, the Pictorial World was established at the heart of news and print production at 63 Fleet Street, London, published by the Newspaper Publishing Company. I've been starting to gather, this is very incomplete, information about different printers, publishers and proprietors of the magazine. It changed hands frequently during its 18 years in print, and as the management changed, there are dramatically shifting visions which are visible in the newspaper itself. I want to just highlight a couple of notable points in this chronology. First, just to comment that for 8 years, the paper was published in or near Fleet Street, but in 1882, it moved significantly further west in London to 149 The Strand, and I'll be talking about that move today. Also, there are these particularly interesting purchases of the newspaper by two giants in London printing, Dalziel Brothers and Richard Clay and Taylor. Both these firms had been involved as printers or illustrators working for the Graphic and the Illustrated London News. So in purchasing the Pictorial World, we can see them seeking to profit from knowledge that had been gained in these other jobs. Both firms owned the paper privately and then floated it for public purchase a year or two into their ownership. So Dalziel had it for a year, and then we see the sale of shares, and very similar with Richard Clay, with prospectuses published in numerous newspapers nationally. Throughout its lifetime, the Pictorial World was keen to make readers feel involved in its success, addressing readers as colleagues and allies. For instance, in the 1870s, there's a repeated editorial appeal that readers buy from their local newsagents rather than direct from the editorial office, as, quote, "in this way, the Pictorial World will become extensively known." In its first issue, the Pictorial World describes itself as a pleasant family newspaper for the great middle class of England and of all English-speaking countries. And the paper's keen to highlight its international distribution. Throughout its history, it remains London-based, but is vocal about its global aspirations. For instance, when it went public in 1883, the prospectus in the St. James Gazette notes, quote, "One of the objects of the directors will be to open up agencies in the colonies and abroad for the sale of the paper, and so make it, as its name implies, the Pictorial World." In 1883, the paper boasted an average weekly distribution of 40,000 copies, occasionally raising to around 50,000 or even 100,000. And the paper's very keen to advertise when issues are unavailable because they've been sold out. Nevertheless, finances were a challenge, and in July 1883, just 3 months after the Dalziels floated the Pictorial World as a public company, it was forced into liquidation by the petition of a creditor, William Barnes Wallen, an artist who contributed both artistically and financially to the paper, and who had complained at losses incurred since, quote, "illustrations which had been given away with the weekly issues of the paper had proved to be very expensive, and the company had got into difficulties." I'll explore today some of these expensive decisions. I'm still figuring out all this rapidly shifting chronology of publishing and ownership, but what's already clear is that these changes created a dynamic print culture in which new managers were keen to maintain the paper's key identity and to introduce innovations, some of which required risky investments with potential artistic and cultural payoffs. So in 1874, the Pictorial World promised to combine not only the best fine artworks ever engraved in any newspaper, but at the same time, the most rapid and lifelike pictures of daily events. Throughout the 1870s, photography, comics, portraits, and pictorial news shared space with reproductive engravings from international exhibitions. Paintings were regularly reproduced from the Royal Academy, the Paris Salon, and Grosvenor Gallery, though for me, these sculptural prints from the Paris exhibition particularly stand out. And they were engraved using intermediary photography. And note with the wood engraving on the right, the decision to include a solid black background in the wood engraving, which is a kind of choice relatively rare in this kind of print because solid blacks were quite hard to achieve in commercial print runs alongside delicate wood engraved lines. So the paper's editors continued to use the latest print technologies, and increasingly wood engravings were replaced by photomechanical process line blocks. From late 1879, when Dalziel took over as the Pictorial World's printer and manager of illustrations, but before they purchased the paper, the firm made bold printing experiments to put the pictorial world at the forefront of technology. On this slide, you can see proofs from the Dalziel's archive, which records the colour printing techniques that were used for the pictorial world. Unusually, in these prints, they combined relief printed key blocks, first using wood engraving for the one on the left, and then using later line blocks with aquatint colour plates. And if you see these in person, the colour printing from the aquatints is really beautiful. The particular combination of relief and intaglio used in these prints was the opposite approach from Baxter's famous colour printing process, and it wasn't a typical approach to commercial colour printing. So it's really interesting to see these experiments. However, while Dalziel were happy to make such innovations on behalf of the paper's previous owners, once they bought the magazine in 1882, they made swift changes back to traditional techniques: pure wood engraving for bold monochrome prints, and colour lithographs for the weekly luxury extra, with some use of colour blocks for wood engraved title pages. Gambling on their audiences preferring better quality print and being willing to pay for it, they were investing in a newly invigorated approach to their own rather time-consuming medium. While technically more traditional, the aesthetic of the paper became more modern. This multi-block wood engraving on the slide here mimics the textures of French lithographic illustration, an astonishing thing to attempt in a linear wood engraving. John Layton designed a new title page for collected issues where the Pictorial World masthead was reimagined. We get the whimsical figure of an ear trumpet, fantasized as kind of telegraphic wire, taking news across the world that is formed by the title words. The ear trumpet might be a private tribute to the new managing director, Gilbert Dalziel, who was deaf. Mason Jackson, wood engraver and art editor of the Illustrated London News, gave a brief commentary on the pictorial world in his 1885 book, The Pictorial Press. I'm going to quote his account in full, it's very short. The Pictorial World was started as a threepenny paper, and after existing several years at that price, it became the property of a company and was raised to sixpence. During the Egyptian War, it made strenuous efforts to obtain a footing on the same platform with the Illustrated London News and the Graphic. The large lithographic portraits published by the Pictorial World were very good. Dalziel was the first big company to own the paper, though the price in fact increased a few months before their 1882 purchase. Nevertheless, Jackson's perception of a capitalist speculation in the pictorial world being accompanied by rising prices is telling, as is his astute comment on the importance of the 1882 Egyptian War to the paper's new image. Disturbing pull-out posters of global violence become its predominant visual offering in late 1882, and its bid for a dramatic new print identity is very much engaged with the war in Egypt. Additionally, the paper's tradition of close, visually confrontational images make formal and aesthetic links between imperialist violence with other scenes of games and leisure. The pictorial world thrived on such contrasts. In 1882, each week, a large print of the Egyptian conflict and/or a colour lithograph of a military figure, usually both, came side by side with the latest instalment of Mary Elizabeth Braddon's illustrated novel, The Golden Calf, So in this issue, you've got an image of medical attention on the battlefield. Then you've got the first illustrated page of the golden calf. Then there are 2 pages just with text finishing the golden calf. Then there's a double colour lithograph of a military hero. Then there's a double wood engraving of another battle scene. So you can really see how Braddon's novel is sort of sandwiched between this militaristic material. On 25th of November 1882, the Pictorial World made a crucial move from offices in the Shoe Lane to its new office at 149 The Strand, another expensive bid to raise the paper's profile. The Pictorial World's new address was close to the Illustrated London News office, also on the Strand, but was a significant 3 blocks further west, right beside Somerset House, where the major institutions of both Empire and publishing were or had recently been located. For instance, the Admiralty had recently been located in Somerset House, and the Stamp Office, which was associated with the history of printing and had by this time become the Inland Revenue, was based there. Over several issues, the paper makes a fanfare of its new premises in a way it had never done for previous removals, and published these prominent notices of removal. A surviving photograph shows the shop window as an exhibition space. The notices of removal back this up verbally and typographically, describing the paper's large colour prints as our portrait gallery. The move coincides with the paper's new approach to its fine art remit, which I've just been outlining. It's at this point that the Pictorial World largely abandons the practice of including big reproductive engravings of fine art, instead focusing on its own ambitious contemporary prints. Increasingly, these often include images of London life. Readers are invited to see the newspaper as itself a lasting gallery. When the Queen opened new law courts in December 1882, it was an opportunity to celebrate the paper's spectacular new premises, as we can see at the right-hand side of this front page illustration. In the accompanying text, the writer fantasizes about the Queen's appreciation of the urban spectacle of the paper. Our front page of the royal procession passing the Pictorial World offices in the Strand conveys some idea of the scene. I'm quoting from the text on the left. In the accompanying, it's worthy of note that as Her Majesty drove past our offices, she noted with a smile of pleasure the row of her own portraits issued by us, and which decked the upper part of the shop window and called the attention of the Princesses Beatrice and Christian thereto. And that's an example of one of the colour lithographic portraits that they had published 2 weeks earlier of Queen Victoria. At the end of December, the Pictorial World published its biggest multi-block engraved poster yet, this astonishing Christmas supplement nearly 1 metre high, which can easily be imagined in the window on the Strand. This new exhibition culture supported the paper's editorial focus on military spectacle. Here we can see the Pictorial World representing its own display at the War Exhibition in South Kensington in February 1883. And this was an exhibition that exhibited a lot of plunder from recent military expeditions, and particularly was raising money for veterans of the Egyptian War. In March 1883, they went a step further and commissioned a hot air balloon, which flew over some military exercises near Crawley, which is south of London, near Gatwick, and near Gatwick today. And the hot air balloon was accompanied by text imagining the balloon as a kind of early drone technology, which brought the latest visual news to readers. And I'll just quote a bit of the accompanying text. This is the first ascent of the balloon which Captain Morton, the eminent aeronaut, has just built for the proprietors of the Pictorial World, was made on Easter Monday from the grounds of the Crawley Gasworks, and some good bird's-eye views of the field of battle were secured. It may be interesting to note that it is intended to make a series of ascents, both in the United Kingdom and abroad, when experienced artists will accompany the aeronaut and the results of their work, and a detailed account of each voyage will appear in the Pictorial World. The proprietors have arranged for a series of experiments in balloon photography. On 14th of April 1883, the final instalment of Braddon's The Golden Calf was published and a replacement serial was announced. Commissioned by Gilbert Dalziel, George Sims and Frederick Barnard's How the Poor Live was something different, investigative journalism replacing fiction, but was equally sensational. How the Poor Live developed the paper's new interest in the urban architecture of central London. Sims's focus included slums around Drury Lane, just around the corner from the Strand and Somerset House, interviewing inhabitants of housing that was both dangerous and expensive, whose tenants could not move to cheaper suburbs because, as Sims explains, they work centrally and cannot afford the omnibus. I won't dwell on the obvious sentimentalism of the well-known image on the left, but it's worth noting that architectural black hole in the foreground, which illustrates the textual point being made here about the dangers of the staircase in this dilapidated building, but which also creates a dramatic abyssal separation between viewer and subject. This illustration is well known, the one on the left, but what isn't is a fascinating large-scale poster, which we can see here on the right, that was made to advertise the new series. Again, this is nearly a metre high, and it was certainly, I think, designed amongst other venues for the magazine's shop window. And this poster wasn't published itself in the Pictorial World, but was just used as advertising material. It's a woodcut rather than a wood engraving, and a proof of it survives in the Dalziel's archives. What's particularly interesting in this poster is the annotation to the print that is visible in the right margin, and I've kind of extracted it at the top of the slide, in Gilbert Dalziel's distinctive hand. Quote, Fred Barnard's Showbill for How the Poor Live by George R. Sims. The use of the term showbill gives an important sense of how the proprietors of the paper saw even if its most political content in terms of a dramatic urban spectacle. While the images of the Egyptian war are equally disturbing, it's worth noting that the subjects of these wood engravings would not have offered any kind of meaningful consent to the use of their images, and Sims and Barnard pretended to be with the school board when they were doing research for this project. And that the subjects of these prints, some of which were drawn so close by, may have themselves been able to view the prints in the nearby window of the Pictorial World. In thus unmasking a contrasting side of central London, the Pictorial World is engaging a social, political, and aesthetic interest in spectacular contrasts that does seem to drive the editorial principles of the paper at this time. In exactly the same issue as this first instalment of How the Poor Live, we have coverage of the coronation of Tsar Alexander III in Moscow. The issue includes two substantial double-page illustrations that commemorate the coronation. One is this double lithographic pair of portraits of the Tsar and Tsarina. The other is an astonishing fold-out wood engraving of one of the solitary sentries guarding the empty railway line, quote, on the occasion of the Emperor and Empress journeying from St. Petersburg to Moscow. To display this strange image of empire, as well as the poster for How the Poor Live, right next to another centre of empire, London's Somerset House, is a fascinating political and commercial choice. But in order to figure how readers saw this spectacular new office-cum-gallery, we must go back to Mason Jackson's cynical comment about, quote, a company who had bought the paper and increased the price by 100% from 3p to 6. What did readers think about paying an extra 3p for the creation of these smart, new, immersive street and exhibition spectacles? There isn't time to say much about the later issues of the Pictorial World, but I'll conclude with a few comments. Sims and Barnard's collaboration on How the Poor Live developed, with later illustrations showing a more vocal image of the inhabitants of the slums, putting them in a more dynamic and challenging dialogue with middle-class authority figures. The serial inspired active readership. At this time, the Pictorial World hadn't regularly featured readers' correspondence, but it now begins to do so, with readers' responses to the journalism of Sims and Barnard published right after several instalments of that serial from June the 23rd onwards. From July the 7th, quote, in answer to numerous requests from subscribers and the public generally, the paper initiated a special fund to try to alleviate the problems outlined in the series. But very soon after this, on August 25th, Richard Clay becomes the paper's new proprietor. He promptly ends the series and shuts down the Readers' Relief Fund. Richard Clay continued the Pictorial World's very ambitious approach to illustration and global ambition. And at the end of 1883, there's a Christmas number co-issued with Le Figaro Illustré, which is a huge issue. It's double the size of the others, which were already fairly large, with very beautiful colour lithographs and bilingual advertisements. The publishers clearly spent less on illustrations later in the 1880s, and quality did decline. But they continued to exploit the inherent value in the paper's earlier prints. And in 1886, the publishers start to advertise sales of back issues of Pictorial World's engravings made in 1883 and 1884, available from 149 The Strand, which became a kind of print shop, making the most of the Pictorial World's historical assets before it was dissolved and acquired by another periodical, Black and White, in 1892, which is another story. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Bethan. It's a wonderful, rich talk. Amazing. So I'm eager to hear questions and comments. I can see many hands up. I'm just going to invite, first of all, Lorraine to ask the first question. Lorraine, could you unmute yourself, please?
I will, but I was just noting that my hands were applauding rather than raising.
Oh.
But that's fine.
I'm sorry. Would you like to ask a question?
I will. I love to. And I want to start by saying thank you to Bethan for such a fabulous, fabulous introduction to a paper I know very little about, and the complexities of its making in all aspects, as it were. I'm going to ask a question that's very small, actually, while I still continue to ponder the larger questions that are still jumbling around in my head. But the small question I wanted to ask you was about that, I think it was bluish colored title page framework for the Pictorial World. And at the top was that amazing header with a kind of, well, I'm
with the ear trumpet.
It's like a tin can audio device. But you mentioned about Gilbert's deafness, and that is a very local instance of the need for magnifying communication. But at the same time, that line that you drew our attention to, which I confess I had overlooked, is also marking that line of kind of global and international communication, you know, across bodies of water and expanses of land. And there's so much going on in that small header, and even with the little profile of the face in the opening letter. Anyway, if you could just talk a little bit more about how much symbolic meaning and communication really is packed into that one little header. I'd love to hear your ideas on that, Bethan. Thank you.
Do you want me to put it on the screen again?
Great, if you can do it.
Have I?
Yes, you have. That's exactly it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've always loved this title, and you know, and it appears in different versions, like color printed in different colors, and yeah, I don't know what to say except yeah, there's usually a globe representing the pictorial world, which I guess is a rather tired and obvious image. And John Layton, who's I suppose the perfect designer um, for a block like this, does this amazing. I think the face in the T looks to me like other images I've seen of the winds, like of the north wind. I don't know if other people see it like that. Um, and to me that that it is a different kind of way of viewing geography, like not through a globe, but through what surely has to be reminding us of the telegraph wire. You can even see the kind of little like spiraling lines on that wire that kind of is sort of
Yeah.
reminiscent of some of the engravings of telegraph cables you see at the time. And yet it's a very, very old technology. And the kind of fantasy fairy-like figure of the wind with this disembodied ear. Of course, it's communication that only goes in one direction, which, the pictorial world very much was. It has this idea of setting up offices in other countries, but that never, as far as I'm aware of, that never happens. And then, yeah, it suddenly occurred to me, of course, this must have been thought of in relation to Gilbert Dalziel's deafness, which is something which, incidentally, Alison mentioned in the introduction, the pronunciation of Dalziel, which I had always said DL myself as but like it is a name that's pronounced DL, but Ailsa Dalziel in an interview with Simon Hoof, you said that the family had pronounced it Dalziel and was very clear about that. And in that same interview talks about Gilbert's deafness, which is yeah. I don't know if that's enough.
Oh, it's wonderfully helpful. Thank you, Bethan. And even just the title itself, Pictorial World, the grandness of that global vision. But anyway, thank you so much. I see other people have their hands up, and I'll mic myself.
Yeah. Thank you, Lorraine. And I'm sorry to cold call you just as you're absorbing the talk. Many apologies about that. I wanted to jump in and make one quick comment about Leighton's illustrated title page there, because that reminds me of some of the illustrations that he's done for other titles too. I'm thinking in particular of the complexities of course, poetry illustration and good words. And so it's interesting too that there's this sort of like rhythmical illustrative repetition across periodicals as well as within a particular issue that Leighton's sort of signaling, and decoding that's such fun.
Mm,
Really important as well. So thank you.
yeah.
David, would you like to jump in?
Uh, yeah, thank you. Sorry, what an interesting way to end the week, and thank you very much, Bethan, for some marvelous visual illustrations there. I wanted to ask. I know it's something that you kind of mentioned it right at the end there. I thought, oh, quick! You mentioned the black and white.
Oh yeah.
And I wondered what the link to the black and white budget was, because I was thinking about the way in which you describe the pictorial world is obviously focusing on um, elements of war and of action, of military action. And black and white budget in particular, I recall, was founded specifically in the 1890s to illustrate or discuss or describe the Boer War, or the Anglo-Dutch War that occurred in South Africa, and I believe was founded by Harmsworth. And so and it's if you look at it, and for those who've looked at it, you'll notice that it's replete with those military images of war and people
Mm,
fighting. And I wondered therefore if there was a connection, and if you could maybe talk a bit more about that, because it strikes me as that's one of those things that is a feature of the late 19th century, is the illustrations that feature in newspapers, including the Illustrated London News, very
mm,
much reflect that interest in the imperial project, war,
mm. Yeah, yeah.
overseas, and maybe say something a bit more about that. There you go.
That's such a great question, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to give a very good answer because I've been sort of gradually working my way through looking at the pictorial world, and I haven't kind of got to that end of it chronologically yet, if you see what I mean. So I'm more familiar with it kind of up until about 85, 86. And haven't explored. I know that it was taken over by Black and White, but I haven't explored that connection yet. But you've just made me want to get onto that ASAP, and that's a really fascinating connection. And it makes me think, it just makes me wonder if, and I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but if that might be one of the reasons why Black and White wanted to acquire the Pictorial World, if they were particularly renowned for that kind of work. I don't know, but thanks.
Prithvi, and then Kathy.
Although I saw David raise. David, did you raise your hand again, or were you saying thank you? Okay. Okay, great. Hello, this was just fantastic. And Bethan, I have so many questions that I could probably take from between now and the end of the hour to ask you all my questions, but I will try to keep it to just one. So, fantastic talk. I loved the sort of story, the trajectory you told, and you mentioned that this wonderful sort of that in 1882 they shifted from fine art reprints to their own contemporary prints that they then showed in this sort of office cum gallery, as you called it, on Strand. And I have a really small question, which may have. So I'm interested in sort of the commercial part of this, right? Those fine art reprints that they were, images from the Royal Academy, did they need to get copyright for it? I mean, I'm interested, because again, right? So why do you move to images of poor people or war that are sort of coming, correspondence on the field or sending you sketches that then get elaborated in the office versus the Royal Academy images? I mean, immediately as I saw the ones you shared, I thought, what's the copyright status of these?
That's a really good question. I mean, copyright law was quite complex at the time, right? And there might be other people here who can answer this better than me. But because certainly I know that, in other times, like, when wood engravers were reproducing drawings of, for example, there's fascinating correspondence between the Dalziels and Ford Madox Brown, where they agree that, like, the Dalziels will have copyright in the wood engravings, but he will maintain the copyright in photographs of his drawings. It's like, really, I've got no idea. That's the kind of thing that's the sort of question that should have occurred to me as I was looking at this. I don't know if anyone else can answer that, but if not, I'm going to go and try and find out, but maybe someone else would know.
Well, and I don't have an answer, but partly it seems to me that's a piece, and I don't know if that's a piece of that shift. And
Yeah.
of course, for you, part of then very quickly, 8 months later, it sounds like the Dalziels went into, I mean, it became too expensive, so they had to sell it again. So it sort of seems like there are these commercial decisions that might be, or these financial decisions that are being made. And again, there's nobody who knows more about the costs of making wood engravings in the 1880s than you. But I mean, it seems like one decision may have led to a worse decision. I don't know. I mean, that's why the copyright question came up for me.
I didn't show a lot of those reproductive engravings, and there are a lot, and there are others of paintings, and they were from this time more in the 1870s, the kind of mid to late 1870s, when when it was still threepence, right, and the illustrations weren't quite so ambitious. So they weren't looking so much like, and they're, later they're clearly making stuff that people can put on their walls. And I even included on the last slide this advert from a framer who's kind of offering their services to frame these prints. Like, that's not the case in the 1870s one. They're much more obviously like just kind of, very beautiful illustrations, but kind of showing people what's in these big exhibitions. And I'd be really surprised if they had any trouble getting permission to reproduce those paintings, because the people exhibiting in the RA would want everyone to know about their work in the RA. I don't think the quality is good enough that it would be like competing with with the revenue they could get from their work. So I'd be surprised if that was an issue, but like it's a really interesting question.
Okay, Kathy.
Yeah, thanks. That was fascinating talk, Bethan, and the journal sounds wonderful. Just on that point about this shift, I wonder whether it's something to do with a changing conception of news value at the time. But my question was actually about the artists. You mentioned Barnard, and I know him as an illustrator of Dickens. But the illustrations from the Egyptian War and so on, did the journal have its own special artists that they were dispatching? I mean, I know the graphic had Sidney Prior Hall. Was there a top guy?
There were two.
Two, okay.
I wrote them down somewhere. Like I can't remember their names. Sorry, I can dig them out. But like the ones that I showed were by, and the best ones are by Sidney and Walter Paget, obviously well, known in connection with Conan Doyle. And they were like really great, but they weren't special artists, so they weren't on the scene. And they're very keen to advertise that they have these special artists, but they're not actually producing very good illustrations. So maybe that's a kind of subjective, but
in that case, having the eyewitness trumps the quality of the illustration, is it?
It felt to me like they wanted to be able to say they had a special artist, but they couldn't really send the best people.
Right.
Interesting. And I can look up those names of who they were.
No, thank you.
I had a question I wanted to ask, and I'm sure other people are thinking the same thing about the pictorial world, Bethan, but also about their own access to periodicals and how that's complicated by, I know in the pictorial world's case, it sounds particularly challenging because you've missing issues. And I can't remember how extensive that is. It sounded fairly extensive. And then you have the lack of digitization of complete issues. But then you also have aspects of the magazine like remediated through this amazing archive, British Museum archive, that you shared the link with us, that you're involved with. And so our access to this magazine, especially for people who can't just go to the British Library and look at copies, for example, is really complicated. So do you have any thoughts on that in terms of like methodology or conceptual ways that you're handling this difficulty in accessing, and any advice that you might want to scale up for other people also kind of concerned about access? Because you're also telling a really interesting like historical narrative based on multiple data points, right, about the shifts in the pictorial world related to different kinds of spaces. And so how do you manage that with the access issues and the lack of completion of all the issues available to you?
That's a really, really, really good question. I mean, from my perspective, right, this is sort of a passion project that I just like kept wanting, that I kind of found out about when I was working in the Dalziels, and then I just felt like it hadn't, like there was so much more to be said about this magazine. So like I haven't got a big plan for like, but like I really think it's an interesting magazine that needs to be digitized. It was a really ambitious, really kind of it had some amazing kind of visual art, really interesting text, kind of fascinating kind of history of ownership. So yeah, I would love there to be a digital version. I think there should be. It's not too bad. The British Library's copy's very kind of patchy. The V&A has a kind of good series, but it's missing kind of some of the pull-out lithographs, which were obviously designed to be pulled out. But it's got a lot of them, so it's not too bad. But obviously that is really, really difficult of access. And all I can say is I think it would be great for it to be digitized, and I'd love to support such a project or be involved in such a project. And if people have ideas, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also I admired Patrick's comment too about sharing this with the Waterloo Directory people. I think that's a really important point. Thank you, Kari. You had your hand up.
I did. I'm going to pull us back into the magazine a little bit. Although I wonder, on the note of digitization, I wonder how much difficulty it might be since it looked like a lot of the illustrations too are bound, as most periodicals are. And I know, having done some digitization work of archival materials, that's also like
We're changing everything.
tricky. And apologies if you can hear my partner talking. He's also in the meeting. But my question was, kind of springboarding off of Kathy's question about the on-site illustrators, I wondered if you knew anything more about the balloon, like where they were sending up artists in the balloons, if you saw or did they actually produce those prints? I'm very curious about what they actually were able to do.
Haven't found any yet, but
Okay.
yeah, there weren't immediately any obvious follow-ups, but I'm still scouring for them, and I'll let you
Okay.
know if I find any. But yeah,
Great. Yeah.
I was kind of disappointed that there wasn't an immediate,
Yeah.
I think it seemed a bit like a kind of
Stunt.
one-off sort of marketing event, but yeah,
Right. Well, it also probably proved to be very expensive as well.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Prithvi.
Sorry, I said I had lots of questions, and I was going to send you this question privately, but since there's no other hands, and it is sort of building on Allison's question. Here, I'll lower my. It's building on Allison's question about digitization, and one of the things that really struck me, Bethan, was at some moment, and I can't remember which slide it was. You mentioned that there was a wood cut rather than a wood engraving. So, I mean, the question I was going to write you privately is, how can you tell? Like, can you teach me how to tell, please? If something is a woodcut versus a wood engraving. But the sort of piggybacking on Allison's question, I mean, if it were digitized, I mean, digitization, obviously, and I'm looking at Laurel here, I mean, digitization does certain things, but the kind of work you're doing in sort of very close examination of the images and sort of thinking about technologies, digitization, and maybe I'm wrong about this, doesn't, that kind of work becomes very difficult to do with digitized archival material. So anyway, that was just a comment, but how do you tell if something is a wood engraving versus a wood cut?
Yeah, you're right. It does become difficult. Have I just let me share that slide. Can you see that?
If you could put it on, oh yeah, if you could put it on share, yeah, I mean slideshow, that would maybe make it
yeah, sorry.
bigger.
Um,
Play from current slide at the very top left, play from current slide. Where
there you go.
Yeah.
Can you see?
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, you can't really see, you're right, the screen, it totally, you need to see the printed impression, and that totally changes. And those color prints I was showing, I mean, the colors just don't show up at all in a photograph, and the texture of the aquatint in those color prints is so like amazing and strange. But like you can kind of get a good idea from this of what I'm talking about, just because the quality of line you can't really see from this. But can you see that it's divided into 8 blocks that have been bolted together? Bearing in mind that this is almost a meter high, those blocks are big, and so you already know that this can't be end grain blocks, that these are clearly like plank blocks, because that isn't the kind of size of end grain blocks that's available. So the kind of cutting techniques are kind of interesting, because they're actually like mimicking the style of a Victorian wood engraving rather than a woodcut, which isn't a kind of tremendously fashionable, the modernist woodcut hasn't quite come in yet. So it is almost imitating the style of a wood engraving, but it's all the lines are much larger. And they probably did use, I mean, it's a relief printing technology, but because it's using larger blocks that certainly would have been planks, then technically it's a woodcut. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I really appreciated that technical explanation of determining the difference. Thank you. And it's harder to do when, of course, you're working with a digitized image, right? Lorraine.
Yes, thank you very much. I've so enjoyed the discussion so far, and of course, it's prompted many more questions and ideas for me, as I'm sure it has for everyone. But the last slide you showed, the slide you just showed, Bethan, is very actually apropos to the question I wanted to ask about illustrations in the pictorial world, and not just in, but outside it, as it were, like in the show bills and in the large. I'm trying to get my mind around a meter long, meter high woodcut made of 8 blocks. I'm just staggered. And then there's, as you mentioned, pull-out lithographs and various kinds of. So my question is really about medium and scale and function, I guess, visual function, pictorial function, commercial function. So again, back to the slide you were just on, the page you showed was so interesting because the columns of type, the type was inset between a pictorial initial on the one side, and then an inset small illustration, then and above an inset larger illustration, right? And so that encapsulates 3 of the forms and sizes of illustration within the pictorial world. Then in addition to those, we've seen full page illustrations as well as fold outs and so forth. And then beside all that are the poster size things used for advertisement purposes and the like. So there's something really interesting going on in pictorial world with respect to the variety of reproductive mediums, as well as size, which again, in a digital world is much harder to ascertain and understand than it is if you've got the physical in front of you. So if you could just talk a little bit more about mediums of reproduction and scale. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Bethan. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing question. I'd be really happy if I had a really good answer to that, because it's a great question. I mean, I think I suppose looking at it from the point of view of the wood engraver, which at that moment the paper is owned by a group of wood engravers, scale is kind of lacking in the medium, right? It's a really small medium, and at this point in the century, the availability of wood blocks is also like getting smaller and smaller, right? Because the century has exhausted the supply of like boxwood blocks, and you see increasingly when you look at blocks that they're made of smaller and smaller composites. So I am sure it's a kind of medium which you have to be thinking about scale. And you can see them trying to think, how can we make our work more spectacular? How can we kind of, how can we get involved with what's happening in the city? How can we go big, And I don't know, I wonder how much Gilbert Dalziel individually is kind of interesting in this respect, because you can see similar things happening in Judy and in Fun and with Ali Sloper. And one of the other things that's always been in my mind that I didn't have time to look into when I was writing about the Dalziels are these really interesting exhibition tickets for Ali Sloper, for and Judy, like from I can't remember the year. I kind of they're kind of mentioned in the catalogue, and I've made notes about it, and I keep thinking to myself like must kind of like go back to these, but where there were exhibitions of paintings like linked to the magazine, right? And that's Gilbert Dalziel as an editor. I think it makes me think of kind of like recent theories of story worlds and like transmedia kind of you know, I like I don't know, like you can see the Victorian publishers thinking about how to create a kind of like experience that goes beyond one medium and crosses into different kinds of visual and immersive experiences, and that seems kind of interesting from where we are as well.
That's so fascinating. Can I ask a follow-up question? Did Pictorial World have an art editor?
I'm not sure. Not that I have discovered. I mean, there was a reviewer who did like who regularly signs the exhibition reviews,
No,
but
I'm
that's
thinking
obviously
about
something different.
who's making the decisions about size, right? Because the printer or the publisher is choosing the dimension of the block to send to the
Yeah,
artist for the pictorial initial or for the inside illustration
yeah,
or for the
yeah,
full page or whatever. So
yeah.
that's who's making the decision then.
I mean, that definitely changes. The thing is, you've got all these different owners, right? And one of the like, and a lot of that information is just, you know, I don't know how one would find it, but that's the interesting thing about the Dalziel's involvement, because they become the printers like 2 years or more than 2 years before they become the owners, and the fact that they make these very, very kind of radical change, aesthetic changes and medium changes after they become the owners, even though you can see that when they were the printers, they were in managing the illustrations. They were obviously acting as brokers of the illustrations because they're working with other people are producing the line blocks, but they're kind of like archiving them and obviously managing the kind of photomechanical illustrations that are coming in. So they've clearly got a lot of power around what's happening in the art in the late, you know, the end of 79 and 80 and 81. But clearly not total control, because they change it totally once they own it. But yeah, I don't have an answer to that. But if anyone has any suggestions of kind of like where such information might be found, I'd love to know.
Thanks so much.
Thank you everybody for a fantastic discussion, and thanks to Bethan for a completely fabulous paper. We'll be talking about it a lot, I know, inspiring us for future discussion. Thank you, Bethan. Thank you all for being here. I also wanted to mention that our next digital event is a book launch for Paul Feist's Digital Victorians, and it's going to be held on the 11th of April, and back to our regular time, 8 a.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. British time. Thank you, everybody, so much. Good to
Thank
see
you
you.
so much.